let's go and start studying Samuel. Okay, so we are starting chapter 15. And just to summarize what we did, we basically saw Absalom, and that's what we're going to see in today's lesson. Absalom is going to be initiating a rebellion against David. And what we saw before was, to a certain degree, setting the foundation for that rebellion. Now, it's very interesting. Everything about this rebellion has its roots in the rape of Amnon, Amnon's rape of his sister Tamar, the response of Absalom then killing Amnon. As a result, he ran away. He was in exile for a few years, for 3 years. And that, of course, creates a real problem, a real tension and a gap in his relationship between him and his father, David. So all these are very, very much connected. What we also saw is that ever since David, his sin with Bathsheba, we see a certain deterioration, decline that leads us into this whole mess. Now, the way Nathan, the prophet, presents it to David, there's a punishment, a punishment for his sin. And what Nathan had said to him, two things that we see relevant with the Absalom. First of all, that the problems that he will face are going to come from within his own family, and that's clearly what we're seeing with Absalom. But also that there's that warning that he says your mistresses are going to be, someone will lay with your mistresses in broad daylight. And that's something we will see later on in Absalom. But I think it's not just punishment. It is punishment, of course, but I think it's also in many ways a natural development. Certainly from the point that Amnon rapes Tamar, there's a natural development, and we see that played out with Absalom, what happens to him, how he was responding, and we're going to see more of that today. But I would like to suggest that there is also a certain, I don't know if it's a natural development or not, but David, in his taking Bathsheba, broke the first rule, okay? He did it first. He violated what should have been the sanctity of the family. And he violated this, particularly in breaking up. I mean, Bathsheba is happily married to Uriah, and he broke the sanctity of that family in the way he approached and took Bathsheba. And so I wonder if Amnon, in raping Tamar, isn't a natural development from that. You see your father, you see what's going on. There's a certain moral standard that has been compromised by David. So it becomes almost a slippery slope for Amnon then to take, look what happened with David. He's up on the roof and he sees this woman and he covets her. Well, Amnon covets Tamar. It wasn't like he was planning to hurt her. He covets her. He just wants her. And he's going with his passion, with his lust, which is exactly what his father had just done. And so I think we're seeing not just a pattern of punishment, of sin and punishment. And I think this is also a very important message for all of us. So often the punishment, it's not just that the punishment matches the sin, but it's so often that the sin itself includes within it the seeds of the punishment. It's almost as if you're bringing it upon yourself. You're allowing a certain evil to penetrate you, to affect those who surround you, and this becomes the natural result. And I just find that also interesting in general when we look at the consequences of sin in general in society, in our own lives, etc. So I just wanted to kind of give that as a sort of background. And last week we saw, 2 weeks ago, what we saw was that there's a real break between David and Absalom. And then at the end of the chapter, David agrees to bring Absalom back. And he's there for 2 years without seeing, he says he allows him to come back to Jerusalem, but David doesn't want to see him. But then at the very end, through Joab's intervention, we have, and this is, I'll just read the last verse of chapter 14. Joab went to the king and reported to him, whereupon he summoned Absalom. He came to the king and flung himself face down to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. And this is a very important piece of the action here, because in kissing Absalom, he in a way signals to the nation, to his court, that he is now okay with Absalom, that he in a way maybe forgives Absalom, maybe gives him a kosher stamp, it gives him legitimacy in a way that he didn't have before, the 2 years that he was hanging out in Jerusalem, but without any legitimacy to the royal family, to the court. And that is very important. So what we're seeing here now, beginning in chapter 15, is in many ways the direct result of that kiss. Now Absalom is accepted. He's not just hiding out in his rooms in Jerusalem. He's accepted. What does he do next? Sometime afterward, Absalom provided himself with a chariot, horses, and 50 outrunners. Absalom used to rise early and stand by the road to the city gates. And whenever a man had a case that was to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" And when he answered, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "It is clear that your claim is right and just, but there is no one assigned to you by the king to hear it." And Absalom went on, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, and everyone with a legal dispute came before me, I would see that he got his rights. And if a man approached to bow to him, Absalom would extend his hand and take hold of him and kiss him." Absalom did this to every Israelite who came to the king for judgment. Thus Absalom won away the hearts of the men of Israel. So we see here that he is using his acceptance to build himself up as a replacement for the king. Okay, so what does he do? First of all, he has the chariots, the horses, 50 outrunners. He's looking like a king. Okay, not only is looking like a king, he's looking like a king in a way the kings of Israel never did. Okay, let's remember in Deuteronomy, God is very, very clear about what a king is allowed to do and what a king is not allowed to do. So I'm just going to refer you briefly to, didn't write down the verse, but I will find it in a minute. Where is it? 1 second. Anyway, I'll keep talking until I find the verse. But God makes it very clear that there are rules for a king, and a king cannot abuse his power. Not just he cannot abuse his power, but a king of Israel needs to be different than a king of Israel, of the nations. Okay, so it says here, I found it. It's in Deuteronomy 17. Okay, and these are the rules of a king. Okay, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart goes astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. So if we just look at that, the chariot, horses, and the 50 outrunners, this is exactly the opposite. Because when God is saying you shouldn't have too many horses, he's talking about too big an army, and he's talking about this kind of thing. Chariots, horses, the kinds of things that you parade around in the city to say, look how great I am as a king. And one of the things that God tells the kings that they need to do is to write their own Torah scroll and to keep the Torah scroll with them at all times. And that's in Deuteronomy 17, verse 18. When he is sitting on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him. Let him read in it all his life so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of his teaching, as well as these laws Thus, he will not act haughtily toward his fellows or deviate from the instructions to the right or to the left. Okay, so God is telling him, you are not more important than anybody else. You are a servant of God just like everybody else. And in fact, when we look at David and Saul, each of them with their failings, they were never this kind. They never were looking for, with the trappings of power and lots of horses and chariots and gold and silver and never. Okay. And this is something that, of course, Absalom is the first thing he does. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that he basically puts himself at the entrance to the city, or even to the entrance of court, to say, where are you, to try to intercept anyone who's coming for judgment. Now, we have already encountered this idea of somebody coming for judgment. And in fact, the Tekoite woman who comes before David with this whole story is essentially pretending to be somebody who's coming to the king for judgment. Who comes to the king for judgment? Somebody who is not able to find recourse in the normal legal system. So in the case of the Tekoite woman, for example, she's looking for a justice that would be make an exception to the rule. Because the rule, of course, is a man kills a man, that the killer is brought to justice and he's killed. Okay. And she's trying to avoid that judgment because she would then lose her only surviving son, which is why she's coming to the king, because it is the king who has the ability to make the exceptions, and to say, for whatever reasons, whether political or more often, just a question of mercy, and to do justice in a more humane way than the actual letter of the law can provide. That is what the king is for. And so he's standing there intercepting these people and basically telling them, king doesn't have time for you. You should just come to me. And if you came to me, I would make it right. Now, most times, in the situation of the Tekoite woman, it is an argument between her and her relatives, but it's about killing somebody. It's not like somebody will be wronged based upon, if David says no, he won't be killed, which is what he says in this example, it's not like the relatives are losing money or something, okay? But many times, a case that would be brought before the king would be a dispute between two people. And one of them wins, the other one loses, okay? And what is Absalom saying here? He said, I would see that he got his rights. In other words, he's saying to everybody, no matter who they are, you're coming before the king, you're right. But what about the other guy? And everybody can't be right, okay? So we see from this that Absalom is not seeking justice. He's seeking popularity. And that's exactly what's going on here, okay? And therefore, the very last words of this section, these first 6 verses, is key. Thus, Absalom won away the hearts of the men of Israel. This is his goal. Okay, now the question here is, when he starts this out, when he begins with, with his, the chariots and all that, what is he really looking for? And even you could say when he comes back to Jerusalem, what is he looking for? Is he looking to be treated like a prince so that he has the trappings of royalty? Or is he looking to replace the king? Now, we know afterwards that he is definitely going to rebel and he actually will replace the king. But what is he looking for initially? Okay. And it's not really clear. It could be he starts out only wanting honor. And he's sitting around for 2 years while David won't talk to him and getting frustrated. And it could be really that when he starts, that's all he really wants is the horses, the chariots, and the 50 outrunners. But clearly at some point it moves to the next. But it could also be that from the beginning, his goal is to rebel against the king. Now, is he rebelling against the king because he hates David or something else going on? So one thing that is important to remember is that Amnon is his older brother. And it's fairly clear, and this is what most of the commentators see, is that Amnon would have been the crown prince. He would have been the son of David who would have inherited him at that point in time. So then the question becomes, when Absalom kills Amnon, is he just doing that to avenge the rape of his sister, or he's also trying to get rid of a rival? Now, I personally think that initially he's only avenging Amnon, but there's no question in my mind that after that happens, he then expects to become the next in line. Instead of being the next in line, he's exiled to Geshur. I mean, he runs away to Geshur, but maybe he expected David to call for him. Oh, my beloved son Absalom, yes, I realize you did the right thing because you killed a son. Yes, you killed my son, but you killed someone who had done a terrible thing, and that never happens. And so he sees, in a way, he's sitting there in Geshur for 3 years, and he sees his chances slipping away. If he has a chance to become the heir to the king, now that Amnon's out of the way, it's slipping away from him. And so that's also something that I think is worth keeping in mind as we continue looking at this. Now, one more thing that I wanted to point out. I mentioned this before, but I think it's something that, you know what, I'll wait on this. I'll wait till we read. No, here, I'm sorry. I'll do this now. If we go back to chapter 14, verse 13, this is part of the Tekoite woman's speech to David, okay? And she says, this verse 13, we've discussed it then, and it's a strange verse, because she says, and the woman said, why then have you planned the like against God's people? And we asked ourselves then, what does this have to do with God's people? What does this have to do with the whole nation? Ostensibly, this is a story of David with 2 sons. One kills the other, and the fact that he has exiled the killer's son. What does that have to do with the nation of Israel? And she says here, in making this pronouncement, your majesty condemns himself, and that your majesty does not bring back his own banished one. Now, I don't believe that this Tekoite woman knew anything about the nature of Absalom. She never met him. She doesn't know anything about him. And I also don't know, and we can't really know, if this sentence is something that Yoav told her to say or not. But I think it very ironic, because essentially what she is already hinting here is that David needs Absalom, because Absalom is somebody that the nation loves. It could be he has a reputation. He's a very charismatic personality. Everybody he meets, he loves. And so she's kind of planting a seed here that says, she's saying it in a positive way. Absalom should be at your side because he's so popular. He will bring the nation closer to you because he will be there at your side. But unfortunately, what we're seeing here, beginning in chapter 15, is that Absalom, yes, he's very popular, but he uses that popular to win away the hearts of the men of Israel. Not to say, me and David were one. If you love me, that means you love David. On the contrary, if you love me, you're going to love me better than David. And he's working his way into the hearts of the nation of Israel to pull them away from David, which is quite the opposite of what the Tekoite woman had said. And clearly not something that David expected. Okay, so let's go on. Verse 7, after a period of 40 years had gone by, Absalom said to the king. So I want to just stop here for a second. This is the beginning of the rebellion right here. And everybody asks the question, what is this 40 years? 40 years from when? It's clearly not 40 years from the verse before, okay, because that would make everybody extremely old. And we also know that David only reigned 40 years. We learned that at the very beginning when we first met David, the king, and the scripture already tells us that he reigned 7 years in Hebron, and then he moved to Jerusalem, and he reigns for a total of 40 years. So if it's 40 years later, well, that's impossible, because David only reigns for 40 years. So there's a number of different theories about this. One of which is that it just means that Absalom himself was 40 years old at this time. And that makes sense. I don't know how old Absalom is when David becomes king. he's born, he's already in existence, I think. But again, it's hard to know, and it's hard to know from that what what that does for a historical kind of timeline. There's another theory. It says, yes, it is 40 years. It's 40 years from the time David became king. And therefore, this takes place in the last year of David's reign. There's a little too much going on here, and then there's some stuff that goes on afterwards. So you could say it's in the last years of his reign, but it might be hard to say it's actually the last year of his reign. Now, it's interesting, Josephus writes 4 years instead of 40, okay? And there are also some of the earliest translations of the Bible also say 4 and not 40. So there are some people that suggest that maybe there was a mistake somewhere and it's really 4 and not 40. I find that a little bit difficult because the numbers are not written here, okay? You don't say the numeral 4 and then you could say, well, somebody added a 0 along the way, but the numbers are written in letters, and it's not like we saw this before with Saul, where it says Saul reigned for 2 years, and that also everybody questions, what do you mean? He can't have only reigned for 2 years. There's too much going on in his reign. And one of the theories was that it really said he reigned for and 2 years. Okay, and that makes sense because in Hebrew, the way you would write 42, similar, let's say 32, 42, whatever, you would saying 30 and then 2. So if you just had the 2, you could say somewhere along the way the 30 got lost. But when you're doing the difference between 4 and 40, they're 2 different words, same as it is in English. 4, F-O-U-R, 40, F-O-R-T-Y, 2 different words. It's not like you lap off one letter, you're going to get the other. It works the same way in Hebrew. So that's a bit of a problem. But on the other hand, I would like to suggest perhaps that the 40, we've seen 40 is a typological number in the Bible. And we know that Moses went up to God before the revelation at Sinai right after, before he comes down with the 10 commandments. He goes up for 40 days and 40 nights. We know that the nation of Israel spends 40 years wandering in the desert. And then in the book of Judges, there are very set periods of time and the land was quiet for 40 years. And sometimes it's quiet for 80 years, and sometimes it's quiet for 20 years. But the 40 years becomes your rule, and therefore, are you more than 40, then you have a great time. And if you're less than 40, then not such a good time. 40 becomes this symbol of a complete good period. Okay, so it could be that this is more symbolically said at the end of a good period of David's reign. Now we're going into trouble. Okay, so these are just a number of different interpretations how to deal with that. But on the other hand, it could really be that it's 4 years. In other words, it really was 4 years, but it's written 40 to give you that more that symbolic view. Okay. But let's leave that for now. We don't know how many years it is. Okay, so that's the first verse. Now let's go. After a period of 40 years have gone by, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow that I made to the Lord. For your servant made a vow when I lived in Geshur of Aram. If the Lord ever brings me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord. The king said to him, go in peace. And so he set out for Hebron. So here he's coming to David and asking permission to go to Hebron. And we'll see that actually he's going to Hebron to start a rebellion. So he's lying to David. He's creating an impression of everything is good. Reminds us of when Absalom went to David and asked his permission and actually invited him to gather the family together for the sheep shearing, which was exactly the time that he killed Amnon, and it was all planned. And he does this in such a way that he knows at his sheep shearing he's going to kill his brother. But the way he presents it to David totally keeps David off guard. Okay, and David believes him. He thinks he's an innocent and he's going to do such a wonderful thing, invite everybody to celebrate the sheep shearing. He seems so generous, so kind. He's hosting everybody for his sheep shearing. Here too, he's making it sound as if he's such a religious man. And when he's sitting in Geshur, he's waiting to the opportunity to come back, and he makes this vow saying, if I come back, Lord, if you bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will go and make a sacrifice to the Lord and in Hebron. Okay, But as we can see, this is all a lie. Why Hebron? We'll recall that Hebron was the place where David first became king. Imagine the symbolism. He is going to begin a rebellion against David in Hebron, which is the very city where David was first crowned king. Even more, Hebron is the capital of Judea. It is the center city of Judea. Judea, of course, is the tribe of David. And it's fascinating because he must have known he could get away with this in Hebron. Well, I don't know. We don't know why or how or what was going on there. You would think that he would have the hardest time declaring a rebellion in Judea, in the center of Judea, in the place that was most loyal to David from the beginning, and in the place that David was most loyal to. Certainly, if you'll recall, when he was with the Philistines, he continues to send presents and things to the elders of Judea. So it's a question, but it could also say something about how successful Absalom was in preparing all of this. And when it says he stole won away the hearts of the men of Israel, it could be he put special attention in winning away the hearts of the people of Hebron because he knew that was going to be the most important place. And you can think about this today. If you're looking at any kind of, I'm not looking at it, let's say rebellion or something like that, but if you're looking even in political rivals, the coup for any political rival is to win away a certain group of people that are seen to be the mainstay of support of the rival person. And so sometimes you're going to try, if you see a weakness or an opportunity, that's the first place you're going to go. Because when you then come forward with, and you know what, I would compare this, I don't like this example, but it's very interesting example. In the US elections that Trump just won, a lot has been made in the press of the fact that he won a significant support from Muslims away from the Democratic Party. Now, what does that say? It wasn't that he got the majority of the Muslims, he didn't, but he made a big fuss over it. And everybody made a big fuss over it. I don't like it because I'm hoping he's not going to feel himself beholden to the Muslims and what was told to them and all that. But meanwhile, what does that say? If the Muslims were the people that were the way Kamala Harris in particular has been so supportive of the Muslim agenda that you would, she's relying on them. She thinks she's got the Muslims of Michigan in her back pocket. And therefore, Trump being able to say, I got some of them, that becomes one of his strongest cards. And it's exactly what's going on here. If David can say, I got Hebron on my side, he's weakening David like never before. Okay? So he goes to Hebron. And what happens? But Absalom sent agents to all the tribes of Israel to say, when you hear the blast of the horn, announce that Absalom has become king in Hebron. 200 men of Jerusalem accompanied Absalom. They were invited and went in good faith, suspecting nothing. In other words, on the one hand, Absalom has sent out people all over the country to be able to announce the rebellion at the same time. And on the other hand, he has 200 men accompanying him, making it look like he has all the support, and they don't know anything about his rebellion. They think he's the son of the king. We love him. Why not? He's a charismatic fellow. Absalom also sent to fetch Ahitophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his town. Gilo, when the sacrifices were to be offered, the conspiracy gained strength, and the people supported Absalom in increasing numbers. Now, I just want to end with two things. First of all, who is Ahitophel? Ahitophel in the end is going to be a key player in this whole story. But Ahitophel himself was one of David's closest advisors. And we'll see later on that Ahitophel, that when David finds out that Ahitophel is on Absalom's side, he's crushed. He works to work against it. He has a plan, but it's very, very interesting. And this I just want to show you because I found this incredibly interesting. A teacher of mine pointed this out, that it's all versed in scripture. So it is as follows. Where is it? Here you go. The theory is that Ahitophel is actually Bathsheba's grandfather. Why? If you look in let's see, if you look in chapter 11, verse 3, you will see that what is her name? Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam. Okay. Now, in chapter 23, verse 34, chapter 23, verse 34, you have a list of David's men, okay? And who do you have here? Eliam, son of Achitophel, the Gilonite. And here we learn that this is Achitophel here is from Gilo. That's exactly what we know about him. So it makes a lot of sense that Bathsheba's father is Eliam, and Eliam's father is Achitophel. And therefore, it's very possible that he lines himself with Absalom as a way of revenging David's rape of his daughter, Bathsheba. So I thought that was a very interesting point. And I just want to conclude, let's just review the timeline that we know until now, okay? First, Absalom, and this is in chapter 13, verse 38. Absalom runs away. This is right after the he murders Amnon, and all the sons of David run back to Jerusalem. And at the same time, Absalom runs away. What do we learn there in that verse? He runs away and he goes to Geshur, which is, as you will recall, where his grandfather is from. And he's there for 3 years. Okay. Then in chapter 14, what we read last week, verse 28, we learn that Absalom came back to Jerusalem and he's there for 2 years before there's any contact between him and David. So we're talking now 5 years 5 years of separation really from David. And then of course we have that kiss at the end of chapter 14. And now we have a situation of we have the actual beginnings of what we have at the beginning of our chapter this week, the first 6 verses, where we see the process that Absalom does to build popularity, to win the hearts of the people. How long does that take? Maybe that takes 4 years. If we're going to say that verse 7 at the end of 40 years is really 4 years, so then we're talking about a process of 9 years. 9 years since the murder of Amnon. Was he planning this for 9 years? Not clear. Was he planning this from the time he got back to Jerusalem? At least part of that time. Okay. So we're talking, let's say 5, 6 years at least that he's planning this. Okay. That he's creating a situation of little by little winning the hearts of the people, creating, and this is a very, very, it's a very wise strategy, because he's not just relying on force. He is going to be relying on winning the people to his side, and only then will he have a chance at this rebellion. So that's where I want to end today. I'm sorry I went over time a bit. Anybody have any questions or comments? Turn on your mics. Love to hear it.
Another alternative for the 40 years, I've got a little note here, is that it could be 40 years from the point when David was anointed by Samuel.
Yes, that's what
Did you say that?
in other words, before he actually reigns.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very possible. That's right. So that brings him to a few years before the end of his reign.
I've got something else here from the Talmud. It's 40 years since the institution of Saul's monarchy in Israel.
Right. But that's problematic because that relies on the fact that it's 2 years to Saul. And so that is problematic, which is why I didn't mention it.
And not just one other little thing. In Psalm 41, verse 9, it says, "Yea, mine own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." That could be David talking about Ahithophel.
Where is that?
Psalm 41.
Yeah.
Verse 9.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's only an oblique reference. It's not like yours, but it could be an additional reference to a familiar friend, a close friend, an advisor.
no, it's true. I mean, he is definitely, it's one of his closest advisors. And we'll see later what we do next week, that as soon as he hears that in fact Achitophel changed sides, he acts immediately to try to render his advice ineffective. And he actually succeeds. David really does, the problem that David has, and we saw this before in his inaction against Amnon. Okay, Amnon is already, he raped his sister. Okay, and David did nothing. And maybe if he had had something then, this whole Absalom killing him would have been avoided. And then when Absalom comes to him and says, "Come to the sheep shearing," he has no suspicion that maybe something is going to be a problem, because Absalom, we know that Absalom was upset, very angry and very upset about what happened to his sister Tamar. So this is all examples of a David who is blind when it comes to his children. And I think, this is really what we're seeing here. But so he's duped and duped and duped and ends up in a situation where he's really in trouble. But once he realizes that Absalom is rebelling and he's very effective, and he rallies, and he immediately sets up spies and he sets up strategies, and he goes into David mode, pulling himself out of weak father of sons into King David mode. And we'll see that transition next week very effectively. Okay, I think anybody else have something they want to say?
I'm just going to say that he's not the first weak father in the scriptures.
Oh, Eli.
Yeah.
Who else did you? Who were you thinking?
Yeah, I was thinking of Eli. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And even Isaac, maybe.
Yeah.
Isaac, right? I don't know if Isaac is weak as much as he's blind.
In every way, yeah.
Right. But David had all the cards in front of him, but he, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, this was great. It's good to see you all.